Hello everyone, this is Professor DK and welcome back to another episode of the Simple Login App series. Now, if you remember in the previous video, we used shared preferences to store the username and the password. So it acts like kind of your offline database where you can store some information, and we stored the username and the password. Now as you can see here, I have the phone connected and you can see the shared preferences file created. You can see that it's a key value pair where you have the username and the password. Now, one of the drawbacks that we had with the previous code is basically only one user can log in at a time, right? Now, let's say I go ahead and try to change the name. Let's say I give a different name, probably Shiva 123 123 123 or something like that. And if I register, I'm gonna refresh here again on Android Studio. So you can see here that it basically overwrites the same file, right? So the username changes to Shiva now and the password is again whatever I entered, right? And this is what we don't want to do. We actually want to make sure that multiple users can actually register and they can then log in into the app. So today what we're going to do is we're going to learn about how we can implement multiple user logins, and we will be doing that using hash maps. So for that, I will be first taking up some theory. I actually do not want to get into the implementation side of it, how a hash map is implemented underneath the code and all that. I mean, that's not important to you guys, right? So what you want to know is how you want to implement what is a hash map first of all, and then how you can implement in your code to achieve something, right? And that's, I think, the most important thing for you guys. So I'm going to take 2 minutes to explain what a hash map is, and then we'll jump right into coding this and making sure that multiple users can log in. All right. Okay guys, so like I showed you the shared preferences, the credentials db.xml file. So it's a shared preferences file, right? And this is how the values are basically stored. It's stored as a key value pair, and you saw that the username and the password were stored. Now what we want to do is we want to implement the same kind of a structure. This is actually nothing but a map, right? It's a mapping finally between two things. So we want to create this kind of mapping again between two things, and here it's going to be multiple usernames and passwords. So what we actually want to achieve is, instead of just having username and password, we will actually change this code to actually store it this way. So I'll be storing my username, and against it I'll be storing my password, right? So whatever it is, right? So 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8, and then there's Shiva, and he's gonna have some password of his own, and this is how we'll be storing the multiple users into the shared preferences file. So now you'll ask me this, so how do I create this kind of structure, right? So that's where the hash map actually comes in. So let's actually try to understand what a hash map is. Okay, so I'm going to break it down into very simple words. So assume you have some input x, and that's passed to some function. You need not worry about what the function is, okay? I really want you to focus on what it is on a very high level, and then go to how we can use it in our application, right? So you can obviously study about the depths of it in any of your data structures course. So I'm not going to get into that, but I'm going to explain it in a very simple way what this is. So give me a minute. Here you give an input x into a function f of x, and let's say it gives you a value y. Now you must be wondering, what is this value y that it generates? So hash map, usually a hash function, it can be any length function, okay? So by length I mean, let's say you have a hash function of fixed length 10, okay? 10 is the length of the hash function. Okay, so what this basically means is, if you create a table, and that's what it's actually going to do, it will basically create a table, a hash table of entries, okay? And based on the length of the hash function that you want, in this case it is 10, right? So it will basically create these placeholders, and it will give you these 10 different entries that you can make in the hash table. Okay, so what actually happens is, let's say you give an input, let's say I pass in Dheeraj into the hash function. It is going to give me some value between 0 to 10. All right, now let's say it actually gives me the value of 0. Okay, so now this is where things get interesting. Okay, so it goes into this particular location here and it's going to store my password. Okay, so this is how we'll be implementing it. So this will be the key and this will be the value that it stores, but where it stores it gets determined by the hash function. Now in Android you don't really need to worry about what the length is, it's going to be pretty large, but this is how a typical hash function works. It's gonna create a hash table, and then based on what the hash function it uses underneath, it's going to create a unique location that it takes to store that. All right, now let's say someone else, okay, tries to use the same username. Okay, so what happens in that case? If we already have this particular value stored here, we already have a value stored, right? So if you pass again the same string to the hash function, it's going to generate the same values. It's not going to be different. Okay, that's how a hash function works. And again, if you have someone else who's named Dheeraj, and if he comes and tries to enter into our app, since it points to the same location, it'll basically check that there is already a password stored. So we already know that there's a user. So what we can do is we can then block this user from actually using that particular username. So that's how a hash table also has that unique feature of making the app unique, making the username unique to its user. So that way only one user can have a particular username, and you can prevent others from taking the same username. Okay. Now, what if there is a different user, right? Now, let's say there is a different user, and when this string gets passed into the hash function, it might probably generate the placeholder value of 10. All right, and that's where the Shiva's password is basically going to get stored, and you will see that here, right? So what this typically does is it's going to finally create a key value pair itself, but the hash function makes it much more easier where it puts the data into a particular hash table, and the placeholder value it's generated by the hash function, which is unique to that particular string, and it ensures that we have unique username which can only be taken by a particular user, and as I said, it's finally a key value pair itself. So this forms the perfect data structure to be used, especially in the case of credentials, right? And we want this particular feature itself. So this is what we're going to implement today, and hopefully this gives you some insight into what a hash table is and how it's going to be helpful in our application today. All right, so let's jump into Android Studio. Enough of all this theory. I'm pretty sure that it might be overwhelming. All right, so let's jump into Android Studio now. Okay guys, so in Android Studio, I have my main activity open. I'm going to close the other files here. All right, and for those of you who actually haven't come this far, I have all the code uploaded here in my GitHub page, so you can go ahead and download it from here, and you can open up the episode 4, because that's where you're going to start with writing the code for episode 5. You can probably use this code if you haven't gotten so far. Okay, so the way you would open your project is you can just go to File, Open Project, and then you can just point to episode 4 and then just get started with it. Okay, so this is what you will see when you open up episode 4. Okay guys, so if you all remember, we actually started with storing the credentials using a class called credentials, right? Now, I mean, all this is good, but we want to implement a hash map. So go ahead and delete all of it. All right. And you can also delete this as well. Okay. So an empty class here is what you have. And now I want you all to create a hash map. Okay. So the way you do it is you just say hash map and just press Alt Enter when you see this underline. You can just place the cursor right next to it or put a space bar, right? So that's when you will see this click on Alt Enter, and it's gonna get imported at the top. Okay, so click on Alt Enter and you should see it coming here at the top. And let's call our hash map variable as credentials mapper is equal to new hash map. Okay, now since we already know what our hash map key value pair data types will be, so we can just put it as string and a string, because we know that the username and the password will be a string, right? So string comma string, this is nothing but this is the key and this is the value. All right, so this is how you create a hash map. And now we need to create functions that will put the data into this credentials mapper, right? So for that, first we need to make it public because we want it to be accessed across all activities. So public void add credential will be our first function, and it's gonna take the username and the password as the parameters. So username, password, simple, credentials mapper dot put, and you can see that when you type in put, it actually gives you the autocomplete options. So you can see the parameters are nothing but the string and the value. And like I already mentioned, we are basically going to store the password against the username. So username becomes the key. So username comma password. All right. Next. So now that we have added the credentials, we actually need to also check if the credentials, before adding the credentials, if the username is already taken or not. So for that, we'll need public, obviously, because we need to access it, boolean, because we want to know if the username is taken or not. So check username can be the name of the other function. We can just pass in, sorry about that. So we can just pass in the username here, and it's gonna return. Basically, we can use credential mapper dot contains key and username. Okay, so what this function actually does is, as the name suggests, right, in Java, that's the important feature about Java, that you can just type in something, and looking at the function name itself, you kind of get a hint on what that function does. So here it basically checks if the key exists. So if the username already exists, we already know that the username is taken, and we can just display it to the user. So it's going to return true or false based on if the user is present or not. And right now you can see that all these functions are grayed out, and this is because it's not being actually called in any of the activities. All right. So the next function will be public boolean verify credentials, or you can call it anything, check credentials, but I'm going to call it as verify credentials. And then this will take both the string and the username, right? So you need to check both. And here, first thing is you check if the username exists, like we did before. So credentials mapper dot contains key username, because it doesn't make sense to check for the password if the username doesn't exist, right? So you check if the username exists, and once it is there, you can then check if the password is equal or not. So if password dot equals, and inside this, what do you pass, right? So it should come from the mapper itself. So the mapper will have all the username and the password key pairs. So dot get, and get takes the username, and it will return the value of the key. Okay, so if both are equal, you can then return true. All right, so let me explain again. So what is happening here is it checks if username exists. All right, and in the next step, we actually check if password matches. All right, and if it matches, you return true. Now what happens if none of this happens, right? You can just say return false at the end of the function. Okay, not that it's all outside but inside the main body of the function. Okay, so return false if none of this happens. If the username does not exist, you return false, and if the password also does not match, you return false. Okay, so this is our third function. So now we need one other function, and the reason for that is, so when your app starts, right, you obviously want to retrieve all the usernames and all the credentials that have been stored previously, right? Because if you exit the app and if you cannot retain all the username, all the registrations that have already taken place, it does not make sense. So we will need another function which takes care of loading the credentials when the app starts. Okay, so we'll call that as load credentials. And what it will take is, it will be a map, right? Because we will be retrieving this from the shared preferences file. That's where we will be storing the username and the passwords. So this will be a map, and it will be a string, and you can type it this way in case the second parameter is going to be a variable, right? A variable as in it could be a string, it could be a boolean. Okay, why am I saying that it could be a boolean? Is because if you remember carefully, we have another shared preferences data that we are storing, which is remember me checkbox, and it is a boolean. So the key is a string but the value is a boolean. So that is why we have different variants of data that are being stored into this map. So that's why I'm going to say the first parameter is definitely a string, which we know for sure, and the second parameter is an unknown, which is basically going to say that it could be a string or a boolean. All right, so this is going to be the preferences map, and for map.entry, this function basically retrieves all the data for you. Okay, you write it the same way, and let's call this as entries credentials. Sorry, not credentials, it's preferences map dot entry set. Okay, and what this is going to do is, it's going to retrieve all the entries in the particular shared preferences map file that we have, and this is nothing but a for loop. So it's going to loop through each of these entries in the for loop, and you can basically process the data however you want. So what are we going to do inside this, right? We only want to deal with the username and the password, the credentials that are stored in the preferences map. We do not want to deal with any other data, right? And by any other data, I mean the remember me checkbox here. So you will see that this is a boolean, and obviously it's not a credential. We do not want to store that. So how do you remove it? So you want to check for an entry dot get key dot equals, and you can just type in, or you can copy paste it from there. Make sure that you have it typed exactly the same way. It is case sensitive. Okay, so if it is not equal to this, and if you observe closely, there is a exclamation mark here, guys. So if you do not put this, it becomes a true condition. So I basically put it against it to make it a not condition. Okay, so only when the entries are not equal to remember me checkbox, that's when you come here, and that basically means that all of the other data is nothing but the credentials that we want, right? So what we want to do with that data is, we want to put it into our hash map that is there. So load the data from the preferences map into the credentials mapper, and the way you do it is, you loop through the preferences map and then make sure that it's not the remember me checkbox or any other data that is not a credential, and then enter this loop and only add the credentials into our credentials mapper. And what do we add inside this? We add the username first. So the username is nothing but the key. So for that we do get key, and secondly for the password, it's nothing but the get value, right? That's the key value, right? And you'll see that it throws an error, and this is because the second parameter that you have, it could be anything, right? We have mentioned that it's a question mark. When this is a string, it's a surety that we have because we have mentioned it here. But the second part, we have to mention that since there is ambiguity on what this data type could be, you need to specify explicitly that it needs to be converted to a toString. Okay, so we put a toString here. Alright, so we have a function that will load the credentials from the preferences map into our hash map that is part of this credentials class. Alright, so now that we have created our class, we need to now use it into our activities. Okay, and obviously if you see here, you already see a bunch of reds, right? And this because we removed a couple of stuff from the credentials class, so that's why it's red. We'll fix that, okay, in a while. Before I actually go into main activity, let's start with registration activity. All right, so I'm going to open up all these functions here. All right, okay, so first thing is we have the credentials here getting created, and we no longer have this particular constructor which takes the username and the passwords, right? So we're going to remove this line, and we're going to say credentials dot add credentials, because that is the function, right? So what do we need to pass? We need to pass the username, and that's registered username here and registered password. Okay, so here at the top we were getting it from our edit text field, so receiving that we are passing it into our class. Okay, now the next part is storing it into the shared preferences. Okay, we are no longer storing it as username and password this way. We are going to change this, and okay, we do not want to delete the entire thing. Okay, so we will be storing the username and the password as key value pairs rather than username against username and then the password, right? So registered name and the registered password. All right, so store the credentials into our shared preferences file. Okay, so you'll notice that when new users keep registering, you are basically creating new key value pairs against the usernames. Okay, but remember, I told you that you need to only add the username only when it's a unique username. Okay, or else it's going to override the same data, right? You do not want to do that. So here you need to add a piece of code which is if credentials dot check username, you need to pass the registered username. Okay, so only if the registered username once it checks, if it says true, then obviously you don't register. You need to throw an error that so you can just copy the toast from here, the toast message that we had here, and we're gonna say username already taken. Okay, so hope you understood what this function is. It checks the username, and obviously if it returns true, it means the username already exists, right? So you need to throw that error, and you shouldn't register that user again. So this should be part of the else loop. Okay, so all these things which you had, all these lines of code need to be cut and then pasted inside the else body. Okay, so make sure you do that. So only when the username is unique, you come inside this and then you add the credentials into the class map. So you do that, and then you also add it to the shared preferences file so that you can save it across sessions after you close the app, right? So obviously after any edits to the shared preferences, you need to call apply, or else it does not reflect into the file. Okay, so on successful registration, obviously you direct them to the new activity. All right, so all this is good, but we need to also fix the main activity. All right, so come here, and if you remember, we are using the credentials variable from registration activity. Let's change that. We no longer need this because as I told you, in registration activity, we are now storing all the credentials into the shared preferences file, right? So let's first come back to registration activity. Let's change public static to just public credentials so that the scope of this variable is only inside this particular file. Okay, so now obviously it's going to throw an error here. So you can see it is now red, and we will create the variable again, public credentials. All right. So this is where we are creating the variable, and after this particular line you can say credentials is equal to new credentials. You need to always instantiate a class. Okay, you simply cannot do any manipulations on a particular object without creating it, and I think I have not done this in the other thing as well. Okay, so here we need to add that. So now you might have one question. So previously we didn't actually instantiate this class, so how was it working and all that, right? So in fact we actually did that. Okay, if you don't remember, so I have the code open here, okay, on GitHub, which is the episode 4's code, and if you go to registration activity, you can see that here at the bottom we were actually creating the credentials. Okay, so we had the constructor here which used to take the username and password. So this is where we actually instantiated the class, and only then we used to manipulate on that particular variable. Okay, so now that we have changed it, it no longer instantiates the class, it just accesses the functions. You need to actually instantiate it at the beginning. So credentials is equal to new credentials, and hopefully this makes it clear. So this is an empty constructor because you don't really do anything, and you don't even need to create an empty constructor here. It's it's understood by default. Okay, so this is how you instantiate, and then you can access it. So now in main activity, like I said, after instantiating it, you can just do let's actually remove this for now. We'll come back to this. All right. Okay, so what is happening here, right? It basically checks if the shared preferences file exists, and if it exists, it was basically taking the username and the password. Okay, whatever was saved before. Okay, but before that, let's say you have multiple users who had registered, so we need to load that. And I told you that in credentials we have created a load credentials function for doing this exactly, right? So first we need to check if the shared preferences map file that we have. Okay, let's actually get all the entries, right? So map and I'm gonna call this as preferences map is equal to shared preferences dot get all. Okay, so we are retrieving the map from the shared preferences file, and first thing is check if it actually has any data stored, right? So as long as it has any data, only then you can work with it. So if the size is not equal to 0, only then you load the credentials from the map file. Okay, so for that, just do credentials dot load credentials, and you need to just pass the map file. Okay, as simple as that, and rest of it is handled in our credentials class. So you load the credentials if we have some data already stored in the shared preferences file. Now what about the other stuff? Okay, so username and password, which we are retrieving here, you'll notice that we actually removed it in our registration activity. Okay, and you might wonder, where does this come from now, right? If you remember, when you actually log in, I'm going to open up all these functions. Some of you looked at this V thing and you thought that it was some code that had written. It's actually not the case. This is something that Android does when it closes the body. Okay, so when you open up the function, it actually opens up that way. So don't think that it is something that I have changed. Okay, it's the same code that you saw in the previous video without any edits. Okay, so coming back to this particular line of code here, the username and password strings are no longer, the keys are no longer stored, right? We removed it from the registration activity. Okay, so we now need a place to create this particular key in the shared preferences file. So now you might ask me, we already have created key value pairs, and it is now no longer username password, it's actually taking the credential itself as the key and mapping it, right? So why do we need this particular way of storing it? Okay, so let me tell you why this is useful. What we're going to do is we are going to change this to last saved username so that we can remove all confusion. So what does this mean? So when you log in, let's say that we save your username and password, and if you log out henceforth, the username and password is stored. So that way you can easily enter the app. So this is some sort of user friendliness that you introduce into your app. Okay, and the way you do that is when you log in, you actually need to pass this into the shared preferences file, right? So we'll go into the login function. Let's fix that up. So here, this is where the login is successful. So we are going to take the shared preferences editor and we're going to do put string, and we're going to do last saved username, pass that as the key. And what is the username that was stored last, right, which was used for login? It is nothing but the input name here at the top, which we have, right? So do that and do the same again for the password. So this ensures that you can log in easily into the app once you have already logged in once, right? So consecutively, when you try to log in, the next time the username and the password is stored. So this improves how fast to get into the app. And like I mentioned already, if you are adding something into the shared preferences file, you always need to apply so that the changes are committed into the file. All right. So we have done that. We have fixed that as well. So when the app basically loads, if you have already logged in once, it's going to retrieve that as well. And if you are wondering what the second part of code is, it's nothing but the default value it should take in case the values don't exist, and that's nothing but an empty string put here. Okay, so we have everything else set up here. Let's now go into registration activity, and we need to do the same thing here like we did for main activity. Okay, we need to actually check if the shared preferences file exists, and I'll tell you why this is needed. Okay, so let's just paste it here, and then I'll tell you why. Okay, so once you paste it, the reason we are doing this is we need to actually check if the username already exists, right, before we let anyone register. So for that sake, when you actually enter into the registration activity, we want to make sure that the credentials, the object that we have created, it has all that details. Okay, otherwise if this is not there, you will notice that we are just instantiating the variable here, and this actually does not have anything, right? It's a new variable. This is different from the variable that you have here. It's not the same. Although we are loading it here, you might think that the data already exists, but it's not the case. The scope of this particular variable is only this file, and in the registration activity, you need to actually do it again. Okay, so you don't need all of this. You just need some aspects of it, which is the first few lines of code. Okay, so I'm going to remove everything else. What we only need is to get the file and get the entries in the file and then load the credentials. Okay, that's all we need to do. Okay, so just add that here. Now coming back to main function here. Okay, we have done all this. No need to change anything else here. We're going to go down into the validate function. Okay, so validate function, you can see that we were earlier checking, it was a simple string match that we are doing, but now we are going to use the hash map for that, and you will see how easy it becomes now to actually do it. Okay, so you can just say return and call credentials dot verify credentials. Verify credentials, and I'm going to pass the username and the password here. Okay, so it's just a return function because this is a boolean, right? So verify credentials will basically return a true or false, and that's what even this function wants. So it's going to take the username and the password that you're passing it. It's going to check into our credentials mapper that we have created, and if the entry exists, then it's gonna say that okay, the credentials match and the value true is returned. Okay, so hopefully everything is clear right now, and I think we have pretty much covered everything. So let's now go ahead and run the app and make sure that everything works as per our plan. All right, so I'm going to run it on our app. Okay guys, so I have the app running here. As you can see, I'm going to open the app info. Okay, so now this is a OnePlus device. Based on whatever Android device you have, make sure that you go into the app settings and go into the storage and cache, and you remove any cache or storage that you might have. Okay, so this is going to ensure that we run the app again from the start, creating the data that we want. Okay, so I'm going to open up the app here, and just for sanity check, I'm going to add in my name and password, and I'm going to try to log in. Obviously it's not going to allow me. It says incorrect credentials at the bottom, a toast message. I'm going into the registration activity here. I'm going to say 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8. I'm going to click on register. Registration successful. I'm going to try to register the user now. Log in the user. 4 5 6 7 8. Okay, sorry, I missed the 8. Now I'm able to log in, and if I come back here, you will notice that it actually saves that, right? So now let's click on the remember me and log in again, so that way it saves that. If I now close the app and come back here, it should have my username and password loaded. Okay, we already had this already prepared, but we just modified it to use the hash map, so that's why I'm actually checking this. If you're wondering why am I doing it again, right? So again, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to register a new user 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 for the user Shiva, and one of the things that you'll notice immediately is the previous username and password is still there. You could modify the code to actually clear this up whenever a new user is registering, or probably populate it with the new user's name. We are going to do that just after this. So anyways, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the username and password to Shiva right now to 3123, and I'm going to click on login. As you can see, the login is successful, but what we want to make sure is that it's just not overwriting the previous users, right? So just type in Dheeraj now and make sure that it's also allowing me to enter the app. Okay, I'm going to enter my password, and you can see that even I'm able to register. So let's go ahead and create another user, Ashok, and 1111111, something like that. Click on registration. Yeah, is done. Now I'm gonna log in Ashok. I don't remember how many ones I added. Okay, finally. Okay, you can see that I have now registered 3 users, and I'm able to log in with the 3 users. I'm going to try to log in with Shiva now. 3123 and you can see that I can just add as many users that I want. It's just going to get appended to our shared preferences file. Let's also make a quick check on if it's actually retaining the data. All right, so now let's okay, we are logging in with Shiva. You can see that login is successful. I'm going to check for my username to 3456778. You can see that I'm able to log in. You can also check for Ashok. Okay, and this is 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 ones. Click on login, it works. And now it's Shiva with 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3, and all 3 of them are able to log in even after we have closed the app. So that means that our shared preferences file is working. But one of the only things that I guess you all saw here, the drawback is even when a new user is registered, the old username and password are getting stored. So let's actually go quickly into Android Studio and fix that as well. Okay, So in Android Studio, I just opened up the credentials DB just so that all of you can look at it. So here you can see that we have my username, which is the key, and my password stored, and the same happens for all the other users as well. And there's the last saved username and the password after someone logs in and exits the app. Okay, so this is what we want to change when a new registered user is added. Okay, so for that, jump into registration activity. We are going to reset the username and password to reflect the new user instead of the old one whenever they log in. Okay, so what I'm going to do is go into eregister.set on click listener, and here we are just going to add a couple of lines of code. So you can just copy it from the main activity as well. Just copy the saved username, saved password line of code, go into registration activity, and right after you added the put string part of code, you can just add in this line of code and just remove the other stuff here. Just keep what you want, and instead of saying, sorry, this should be the editor, right? So editor dot put string. Okay, so here you're doing a put string because you want to write into the file. So last saved username will be the registered username, whatever the new user you're adding. Okay, that's what you want to be reflected in the code. Okay, so last saved username, and that's what you will okay, let me check again. Yeah, registered password, and you're gonna come into the main activity. After registration, it's gonna retrieve the saved username and password, which is going to be the last registered user as well after the registration. And in case it gets changed, and we are also modifying it here, if you see, once the login also happens. So we have two places where we are actually saving the last logged in user. Okay, so we are doing that in two different places. So now that everything's done, you can again run the code, and you'll notice that everything is now fixed. Okay, so I have the app running here now, so I can just type in probably Raj, and I'm gonna put in 8888888. Sorry, okay, 8 8s, and you can see now that the new user who is registered, those values basically get set in the login application rather than the old username and password. And you can click on login, and if you close the app and come back to this, you will also notice that Raj is the last saved username as well. And in case, yeah, obviously you can modify it to Ashok as well, and yeah, all of that is just fine. Everything works. So hopefully this was helpful to you all, and it taught you something. It explained a particular concept, and also it explained how you can apply that concept so that it crystallizes what you are learning. So hopefully I was able to explain it well, and this basically completes the series that I had planned as part of the login app. And in case you want to know something more, definitely do let me know. I'm actually planning a series on Flutter, and also a series on Android Studio. The beginners always asked me to create a series on how they can get started with Android Studio. So that's also something that I've been planning. So I'll just upload it whenever I can. I'm just stuck with some work, and also I'm studying as well at this time for my MTech. So hopefully when I get time, I'll make sure that I upload the videos. But thank you all for the response that I've been getting for all my videos. So hopefully you enjoyed this one as well. So if you like this, please make sure that you like the video, and also provide your comments in the comment section below on what you want to see next. And stay tuned for the next video, I guess. So happy learning, guys. See you guys in the next video.